Let's assume hypothetically that Mr. Assange is extradited from the UK to Sweden. Let's assume further that the United States government charges Mr. Assange with a federal crime. Now, it's fair to say the U.S. government is going to want Mr. Assange in U.S. custody, however that happens. And there are 4 ways that that can take place. Extradition and 3 alternatives to extradition, all recognized under U.S. law as being legal. When a wanted person is to be transferred from one state to another for the purposes of criminal prosecution, then extradition is the appropriate procedure. Formal extradition would begin with the U.S. government serving Sweden with a request for Mr. Assange to be extradited to the U.S. An extradition hearing would take place, and Mr. Assange would either be sent to the U.S. or not. If Mr. Assange lost the extradition hearing and he was facing a potential death penalty, then Sweden would probably request that the U.S. take death off the table. That is, that the most Mr. Assange would potentially face, depending upon the statute charged, is life without parole, without early release. And life in the U.S. federal system is life. They'd carry him out in a box. An alternative to extradition is expulsion. If the Swedish judiciary, in this case, is as biased as the defense suggests, and political pressure is brought to bear, rather than placing Mr. Assange in extradition proceedings, it could choose to simply label him as persona non grata and take him to the nearest international airport and turn him over to the FBI and U.S. Marshal Service. Seems far-fetched, doesn't it? But the U.S. and its allies do this more frequently than you would think. We've seen, for example, in the Victor Bout case, ironically in cables released by WikiLeaks, that politics in extradition cases does matter. Further, the Swedish politicians could have an agreement with the U.S. that the U.S. would not seek the death penalty in exchange for Sweden expelling Mr. Assange, all legal under U.S. law. Kidnapping is another alternative to extradition. If Mr. Assange were kidnapped and sent to the U.S., the fact that he was kidnapped in contravention of Swedish law is not the basis for having the U.S. federal criminal charges dismissed. The U.S. Supreme Court has held that if an extradition treaty does not specifically prohibit kidnapping, and there's no U.S. treaty that prohibits kidnapping that I'm aware of, then the charges stand. Tricking and lying as an alternative to extradition, it's okay legally for the U.S. government to trick, lie, and deceive in such a way as to cause Mr. Assange to be lured to a jurisdiction where he would be immediately rendered to the U.S. Now, it's important to note, number one, whether Mr. Assange was kidnapped or tricked or lied to, death is still on the table, again, depending upon the statute charged. And number two, all of the alternatives to extradition that I've described in this video are all legal under U.S. law. I'm Douglas McNabb, Senior Principal for the law firm of McNabb Associates.